G'day, I'm Derek Philibrandt, publisher of the Western Standard. Today is January 13th, 2021. We've got a really special episode for you today. We're going to be discussing shocking new polls conducted for the Western Standard by Main Street Research. We're joined with a special guest today, Keto Magee, coming to us from the center of the universe, Toronto. How you doing, Keto?
Actually, I'm in Ottawa.
You're in Ottawa?
I am.
At least I like Ottawa.
Even more the center of the universe.
Indeed. We're also joined from beautiful British Columbia by Western Standard News editor Dave Naylor. How you doing, Dave?
I'm good, Derek. Afternoon, gentlemen.
And joining me in the studio in our downtown Calgary offices today is Western Standard podcast editor and columnist extraordinaire, Corey Morgan.
Hey, Corey. Good afternoon.
Even though, I don't know, it's kind of weird to greet each other when we've been in the office all day together, but... Yeah. So we've got some really interesting numbers. But before we do, I just want to remind everyone, the Western Standard is funded by members like you. If you support the Western Standard, please go to westernstandardonline.com, go to membership. For a few bucks a month, you can support independent Western journalism. We refuse to take any of the federal government's media bailout. We're funded completely by advertisers and by members like you. And so those of you who are already members, thank you very much for your support. And if you're not a member, but you like what we're doing, please consider becoming one today. But let's dive right into it. Keto, very appreciate you working with us on these polls. There's some really fascinating stuff. We've gone through quite a bit here. I'll just kind of give an overview really quickly of the different topics we've polled on, and then we're going to dive into each one. You have polled on where people intend to vote in Alberta right now, a snapshot. It's incredible numbers. UCP support's completely collapsed. We'll get into that. You've polled on what Albertans think needs to happen in the wake of the Great Snowbird scandal. What do people think Jason Kenney needs to resign? Does he need to fire the Snowbird MLAs? Has he done enough, or did he do too much? We've got numbers on that. We've got numbers on what Albertans think about the lockdown. Numbers showing that a rising, growing minority of Albertans are opposed to the lockdown, some of them very much so. We also did some new polling numbers on support in Alberta for an independent Alberta by itself, and as well as support in Alberta for broader Western independence. And we've got some very interesting numbers there. But we're going to go straight to Keto now for some. Actually, we're going to go to Dave first just for an overview on the numbers. Shocking new polling numbers on support for the different political parties in Alberta. Dave, run us through the numbers.
Yeah, those numbers are, as Keto himself said, horrific for Jason Kenney and the ruling UCP. If an election was held today, we'd be saying Premier Rachel Notley again. Only 26% support for the UCP under Jason Kenney, compared to 41% of support for Albertans for the NDP. Wild Rose Independence Party takes just 9% along with that. This is a very, very recent poll, Derek, as you know. Main Street was out in the field on January 6th to 7th. So it was just last week. And it's just a total collapse of support for the UCP. And I think the quote from Keto was, "It's absolutely terrible for Jason Kenney." Keto, were the numbers as staggering to you as they were to me?
Yeah, I mean, before I start, I guess, I've gotten in trouble for some of this stuff in the past in terms of not making the correct caveats here. Remember that a poll is a snapshot in time. Remember when we did this poll, sort of right on top of this scandal. Obviously, numbers change. We've seen numbers change dramatically in Alberta before. So, but certainly at this time right now, and certainly from when we did this this latest snapshot, I mean, to put in context here, this is the highest, including just before the 2015 election, the highest that the NDP has ever pulled. You know, you were talking about all voters, 26. You know, when you look at decided and leaning vote, it's 48-31. Yeah, UCP doing just a little bit better than they did at the end of the 2015 election, where I believe they got around 27%. But remember, that was with a divided right. So this is actually slightly better than the PCs did in 2015, but this is the highest the NDP has ever pulled. So, you know, that is the shocking part, to be quite honest, is that that the NDP is enjoying that level of support, higher than just before the 2015 election. I think the highest we ever pulled them before was around 44%. I've never seen any poll, ours or others, that has had the NDP support this high before.
Corey?
Yeah, well, this stunned even me. I mean, we kind of expected, you know, you could see the backlash, you could see the discontent on left and right. Kenny and the UCP just can't seem to grab traction no matter what they try to do. But still, this was shocking. And the caucus is rattled. I talked to a member or two off the record, and you know, internals, I'm sure, are probably saying the same thing. And Kenny has really got to fear internal discord at this time, because if there's anything that motivates an MLA, it's if they think their own job's on the line, and then party loyalty or loyalty to a particular leader suddenly doesn't seem to be the top priority. Not saying every member is considering these things, but when they start looking at numbers and thinking, boy, I'm going to be unemployed in 2 years, they start reconsidering where they're going. And with an up-and-coming party coming up on the right flank, particularly in rural areas, I think we might see some very interesting things happening in the near future here.
Comment from Sandy McLennan. Sandy, I think you're confusing federal and provincial. The Liberals provincially, I think, are 2% in this poll. Justin Trudeau is a federal politician, so any divide between Kenny's UCP and the Wild Rose Independence Party has very little to do with Justin Trudeau. They're entirely different levels of government. So I just think a little bit of confusion between the levels of government there. Keto, what do you think is? Obviously, there's much at play here, and this poll was taken fresh off the heels of the Great Snowbird scandal. But what do you think are the primary factors driving the collapse in support, both to the NDP and to the Wild Rose Independence Party? What are the issues and factors that are driving that exodus of supporters at this time?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's sort of an impossible stuck between a rock and a hard place for Jason Kenney right now, in terms of what are the two main driving factors behind these numbers, being both, you know, what's going on with the pandemic and the lockdowns, you know, and this current scandal. It's very difficult to navigate, and then when we throw on top of that the issue of Alberta or Western independence, again, it's very difficult to see how Jason Kenney and the UCP navigate this ahead of the next election. I mean, sure, this anger over this particular scandal will dissipate. I mean, the most interesting number to me was when we look at, because we did also ask how people intended to vote federally, how they voted in the last federal election, how they voted in the last provincial election. When I look at that breakout for the past provincial vote, and it says that 21% of their of UCP vote said that Jason Kenney should resign as a result, and the 6 MLAs should all resign as a result of
well, that's bringing us into our next poll here. I guess we can transition now. So when we come back to you in a second, Keto, Dave can run us through these numbers here. What do Albertans think needs to happen in the wake of the Snowbird scandal? What do they want to see happen for accountability? And then we'll come back to you, Keto. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I guess we want to introduce these numbers first before we dive into them. Dave, why don't you take it away? Dave, you are muted. Dave is muted again.
Sorry about that, guys. The snowbird scandal seems to have hit the UCP party hard, and particularly Jason Kenney. And kind of a stunning number to me that 41% of the people that were polled by Keto's staff says that Kenney should resign himself. 41% of all Alberta voters said that, and they want the 6 backbenchers out too. So the 6 snowbird MLAs who flew to Arizona and Vegas and Hawaii. And that figure includes 21% of the people that voted for UCP in the last election. 27% of people said Kenney's actions to date don't go far enough. All he's done, he's fired his chief of staff, and he's reduced Tracy Allard from Minister of Municipal Affairs back to just being regular old Grand Prairie MLA. That's a hit that's going to cost her $60,000 in salary. His chief of staff, Jamie Huckabee, he was on $250,000 a year. So those are the only 2 that are going to take a big financial hit because of it. All the other MLAs were demoted from their cabinet responsibilities in terms of legislature committees that I'm sure nobody cares about, not even them. So most of the people you talk to, Keto, not happy with Kenney and not happy with the actions that he's taken so far.
Yeah, correct. And going back to what I was saying earlier, you can actually measure the extent of the damage from this particular scandal on its own by looking at that breakout number of them, the number of people who said they would vote UCP who indicated to us, self-disclosed that they voted UCP in the last election, in 2019 election, and how they would vote today. Just 6% of those people said that Jason Kenney and the 6 MLAs should resign. I mean, that's a 15-point gap. There's your damage. Does it mean he should resign? Does it mean he will? In fact, it probably would be worse if he did. No, but this number tells us the exact damage that this particular scandal has had on the UCP and on Jason Kenney's popularity. It's astonishing. Haven't seen something like this since, I would say, Gomery days on Paul Martin's vote intentions and approval numbers.
The high level numbers are what get people to read an article, but it's the cross tabulations, it's the digging into the data that's really interesting, and I think you're capturing it here, Keto. You said it's 20 or 21% of people who voted UCP in the last election say that Jason Kenney should resign, which is the most nuclear option that we had in this poll. But then still, I think 30 odd said that Kenney needs to fire the minister and the other 6 snowbird MLAs from the UCP caucus, something that's significantly more harsh than Kenney has done to date. So that would be a majority of people who voted UCP in the last election who are saying
that he should do more.
That he should do a lot more, ranging from resign to fire 7 MLAs from the caucus. And I've never heard of 7 MLAs being fired collectively. That would be a red wedding of a political night. Keto, as you said, we can actually measure quite significantly how much this is bitten out of them because so many of them came from people who say they voted UCP in the last election. Is there really a way out of this for Kenney? Obviously, he won't resign. I think I got a bridge to sell you if you think he will. But is there really a way out of this other than just keep his head down and hope people forget about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think time. I always use the example, not just when polling Alberta, but I always use the example nationally about what we saw leading up to the 2015 election in Alberta. 60 days before the election was called, at the time, Jim Prentice and the PCs were polling in the mid-50s with the Wild Rose in the low 20s and the NDP a distant third, not even. And then to see what happened on election day, to see that shift in numbers, 30-point shift for the PCs, downward, more than 15 points upwards for the Wild Rose, and like the reverse of the PCs for the NDP at that time, going from mid-teens up to what they got on election day, 41%. You know, we had them polling as high as 44 about 3 or 4 days out, and then they came back down to 41%. You know, of course, there's always a way out. It's 2 years to the election. This anger will dissipate. You know, and you know, but it's as you said, a majority of his own base is hoping that the premier does something else, that there should be more consequences. You know, I certainly don't envy him his position on having to navigate this for the next couple of months, and then even leading up until the next election. When we look at some of the other numbers around how the pandemic and lockdowns, his handling of the pandemic and lockdowns, and some of the sentiment around Western alienation and independence for Alberta or Western Canada, all of these things point to a very difficult political navigation for the premier between now and the next election.
Corey, obviously you've been watching this as it happens. You know, you've written some columns on it. This has clearly infuriated people on both sides. The scandal on the left seems to have died as soon as it's caught up Naheed Nenshi. You've written on that, but you know, you're a guy who's pretty in touch with kind of the conservative UCP base. Do you think this is going to have a significant lasting repercussion, or is this going to be more or less forgotten in 2 years when people go to vote?
No, it's going to be lasting because it's a matter of trust. Even if people forget the issue specifically, they've got a feeling of mistrust. You know, that there's nothing hurts more than hypocrisy, and that's what this was. I mean, we're all suffering. The whole world is suffering under this pandemic. We're doing sacrifices. We're staying in. And then we got that feeling that those who are telling us to stay in aren't doing the same thing. This is a horrific demonstration to people. And I mean, it's not to say it's impossible to gain that trust back, but it's going to take work. Like, just leaving it alone is not going to recover what was lost. He's got to reach out and somehow get those people back. And I'm not sure how he's going to do it.
All right. Well, we're going to move on to the next one here that is very closely related to it. We've got more polling from Keto and Main Street here on what Albertans are thinking of the lockdown. Now, before any of you say fake news, remember, almost everyone I know is against the lockdown, but we tend to self-segment. We hang out with people who think like us. People around us shape what we think. I really don't know very many people who think that we should continue to be locked down, but I don't doubt that I'm in my own bubble. We're all in bubbles right now. It's illegal to go do anything. If you go try to talk to somebody at a coffee shop, you'll get arrested. So, of course, everyone you know, if you support lockdowns, chances are everyone around you also supports lockdowns. If you're against lockdowns, chances are everyone around you also is against lockdowns. So before anyone says fake news, just know that we self-segment. But we do have new polling numbers on this. On the second lockdown, we asked people which statement most they agree with. Dave, why don't you run us through the numbers on the lockdown poll before we kick it to Keto for some insight?
Yeah, sure, Derek. Again, some interesting numbers here. I'll just give you the overall numbers, and then sure, Keto can break them down from there. 48% of people in the poll, it's nearly half, said that they're happy with the lockdowns and that health officials should keep the lockdowns in place. Another 9% went even further and said that the lockdown should stay in place until the entire population is vaccinated. And God knows when that'll be. 27%, so almost a third of the people polled, said the full lockdown should end immediately, but they want some restrictions left in place. And 12% said all that the lockdown should be ended immediately, no matter what. And when Keto and I were talking, and this goes back to what you were saying, Derek, about we're all in our own little bubble. I think he agreed with me that a lot of the anger is on social media driven, and that's what you see. You get the vocal minority who are against the lockdowns, and that's all you see in your social media stream, is that the lockdown must be ended. The lockdown must be ended. And I think, Keto, you aptly put it right when you called that segment of the population, quote, noisy, unquote.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, lots has been talked about sort of how social media and the decline of a diversity of media in general has created these echo chambers where essentially you go on a platform and all you're seeing, and remember the algorithms as well. The algorithms learn what our own views and attitudes are, and it just feeds us that content. And in polling we call it confirmation bias. It just reinforces our own views because that's all we see around us. It's pretty dangerous for society when that happens, when you have this polarization. I mean, these views are definitely split in Alberta here. Sure, you have sort of the two extremes: the people who want it locked down until everyone is vaccinated. That's a small percentage of the population, and the 12% that say end all lockdowns and all restrictions 100% immediately and never bring them back. I mean, most reasonable people are somewhere in the middle there, where we know that some restrictions have to exist, perhaps even lockdowns to some limited extent. And that's where the vast majority of those opinions exist. The 27% who want the lockdowns ended, but with some restrictions, and the 40 and change percent that want lockdowns extended until public health officials say it's safe. I mean, and I think that's up to interpretation. I think that's where the majority of all of us want for our certainly parents and our children to have that safety and make sure that we remain safe and our neighbors. It's just where you draw the line on what is reasonable in terms of how we act. So.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. Keto, we haven't pulled on this. We haven't asked anyone to pull on it previously, but I do recall I've seen polling. I'm not sure if it was from you or from others, but I have seen polling on support or opposition to lockdowns. It may have been worded differently, but how does this compare with these numbers? It's still a majority in support of lockdowns, but let's see, 39%. To one degree or another, who believe the lockdown needs to end now. The differences being how much restriction stays in place. 39%. Do you want to talk about how much that has changed? We won't even compare to March, when it was almost unanimity. For all we knew, this was the bubonic plague and it was going to kill everybody. So there was almost unanimity for lockdowns when this started, even if we don't admit that. But at the time, people were broadly supportive. But maybe if we can go back to somewhere, beginning in the earlier fall into the winter, how have these numbers changed in terms of support or opposition to lockdowns?
Yeah, we've asked this question, not just in Alberta, but nationally and in different provinces. I can't speak to others, but I have seen others. I think usually still has a majority of people in other provinces that I've seen, in Eastern Canada, certainly in Ontario and Quebec, that is in support of lockdowns. And I mean, if ask Doug Ford what a lockdown means. There's still some freedoms of mobility. Even here in Ontario under emergency stay-at-home orders. I think it's more, sort of the word is scary, lockdown. I think at the beginning, as you said, Derek, it would have been 90%. We've still seen it as a majority. The last time we asked this question 3 or 4 times throughout the pandemic, the last time being in November. And even in Alberta, there was still a majority that were, again, this is back in November. I think, remember that all of these factors are compounding. We're in the winter. It's the coldest month, January. We're going into at least 2 more months of winter, and people are they're fed up of being on lockdown. But again, I think it's important for people to remember that this is just a word. What it actually means different things across the country. it means different things in different regions as well. I mean, there are safer regions in Alberta and in different parts of Canada as well. I mean, the most famous being the Atlantic bubble, where they've had very, very few cases. People have a lot more freedom to do what they want.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to you. Actually, maybe I will go to Keto again right here before I put it back to Corey. We're always interested in what's below the headline number here. What are the crosstabs? Why don't you tell us, what stands out to you about how this breaks out along support for different political parties? So what is the partisan cutting lines here, and some of the regional or demographic lines in terms of who is more likely to support lockdowns and who is more likely to oppose lockdowns based on party, region, and demographics?
Yeah, and this is why, going back to what I said earlier in terms of how Jason Kenney navigates this is really, really, it's like, kind of shrug your shoulders, like, how do you manage this? Because, we know a majority supports a lockdown to some extent or another. Until public health officials say it's safe, that's an overwhelm. That's over 48%. Another 9% until everybody's vaccinated. I think that one's unrealistic anyway. But
that'd be until next September at best.
Yeah, and depending on the province, and is it 100%? We're never going to get to 100%. I think 60-70% is probably likely before the end of the year. But that's a majority. Remember, that's 57% of the population. But when you look at whether it's the current UCP vote or past UCP vote, it's a majority of those supporters who hold the absolute opposing view. So how do you navigate that as a political leader, as the premier of a province? That this is what your best public health advisors are telling you to do. That this is what the province, the majority of the province wants you to do. But on the other hand, your voting base opposes it. It's a no-win situation for Jason Kenney. At least right now, it looks that way. Lots of things. There are no events, and I don't want to disagree with Corey on it. On this, but we don't know what the future brings. We don't know what events will transpire in 2022 that might completely reverse the political landscape in Alberta. They say a week is an eternity in politics. So 2 years is like a long, long time. We don't know what's going to happen.
Indeed. So I want to follow right off of that, Corey. I think the summary of this poll, I think, can be summed up as a shrinking majority of Albertans still support lockdowns, but the opposition to it is growing fast. It's now a very sizable minority. But as Keto said, the people who Kenney needs to actually vote for him are the people who oppose lockdowns. How do you think this is going to play out politically? Is Kenney going to earn any support from the people who want lockdowns, or does he risk losing the support from people who are opposed to them? How does he thread the needle when a majority of his voters are opposed to them, but a significant minority of UCP voters still support lockdowns? How do you think he threads this?
Yeah, if I had a direct answer, I'd probably have a great job in his office right now.
Pays $250,000 a year.
Yeah, he's walking a razor's edge, though, and as you said, it's sort of, as Keto said too, very no-win. I mean, people sometimes wonder why conservative leaders will lean a little bit too much towards, say, a socially conservative minority or things like that. Well, that's because the conservative base is integral to the party. Those are your door knockers. Those are your donors. These are the people that get you elected, even though they might not represent the majority, who are the voters who, in the much bigger picture, get you elected. He can't afford to alienate too many of either side right now. And but it seems a lot of his efforts in trying not to, he's just ticking them off on both sides. So how he's going to find that balance, I honestly don't know. But he's going to have to get on it. As Keto said too, things can change really fast in politics. But he's really got to find a magic bullet here somewhere.
All right, well, we're going to move on to the last part here. We've got two polls in this last segment here. On the independence question, it's obviously been burning in Alberta for some time. It came into particular prominence after the 2019 election. Since then, there's been a lot of movement, mergers of parties, different organizations, fair deal panels, a lot of different things going on. We've pulled on it before with Northwest Research. We had different results, but we were asking different questions. When we pulled on it with Northwest Research, we had higher support for independence, but it was worded as, if Alberta failed to obtain a fair deal from Ottawa and then held a referendum, how would you vote? And support for independence there, and for just Alberta independence, was, I think, close to 45%. But that was in the scenario where we've tried to get a deal first and failed, which I think is probably a more realistic scenario. I can't see the province holding a referendum without first presenting some kind of counter proposal to Ottawa before cutting the cord. But in either case, we asked a more black and white, or Keto asked a more black and white question this time. We asked that how people would vote on a referendum on Alberta independence, and then we asked how people would vote on a referendum if all four Western provinces together were all having a referendum at the same time on Western independence. So, Dave, why don't you run us first through the Alberta independence numbers and then the Western independence numbers before we kick it back to Keto?
Yeah, 2 polls in one, Derek. What a deal. The first poll asking whether Albertans should, what they would vote in a referendum, 71% said that they would vote to stay within Canada. 25% said they would vote to leave and have a go on it themselves. 4% said they didn't know or didn't care, so we'll ignore those guys. Keto says, when I was talking to him, that they've been polling before, and that 25% figure is rising steadily. When they first started doing polls on it, it was in the teens and then the 20s, and now we're up to 25%. And the poll significantly changes when you ask whether you would support a referendum on independence if all 4 Western provinces came along for the ride. People voting for it then have shot up to 36% of the total who said they'd be willing to give it a go, and 59% of people said they would prefer to remain in Canada. Those same 5% said they didn't know, they didn't care. So I think, Keto, you explained it to me that the figure goes up because the people that are voting feel more comfortable economically when there's 4 Western provinces doing it all by themselves, or as opposed to Alberta doing it all by themselves.
So, Keto, maybe you obviously run us down through these numbers, but also maybe, as I said, this differs from a previous poll we did on Alberta independence. We just did Alberta by itself, not the broader Western question. But maybe speak to, is the Western question a proxy for openness to independence, but cautiousness or shyness about the viability of it without other partners? What is it that stands out in these numbers for you? And maybe elaborate on how they've changed from what you've seen previously.
Yeah, I mean, to me, these were the most shocking numbers. As Dave said, we've asked this question before, going back the 10 years that Main Street Research has been in existence, publishing polls for the last 7 publicly. We've asked this question at least a dozen times, never have had a numbers this high, I think by a factor of 2 at least. And I think you're right about the difference between the Alberta independence number versus the Western Canada number. I would almost say that this is probably like chalk it up to like confirmed support and kind of soft support for Alberta independence. That maybe with some other reassurances and under other conditions, up to 36% of Albertans might be able to support Alberta independence. But again, there's something holding people back on that number. Still, regardless, both these numbers, the 25%, extremely significant, the highest we've ever seen it, 36%. I don't believe we've ever asked this particular question before, so I don't have a baseline to work from. Still, both these numbers are significant and the highest that we've ever measured.
Well, let's put it to Corey. It's different from we asked, as I've said before. It's a different question than we asked back in June. That was, should Alberta be, if we try to obtain a fair deal and it failed, should Alberta be an independent country? And then we had different degrees. We had strongly agree, somewhat agree, and then same on the disagree side. So it would be down from that, but compared to other comparable polls from, say, Main Street, Ipsos Reid, Angus Reid, it is up significantly. What do you think is driving this uptick? Because it's higher right now. You would think it would not be this high. You would think it'd be lower right now than it was immediately after the 2019 federal election when Trudeau came to power. What do you think has changed to actually drive it up from that high point of rage when Wexit, became a big thing all of a sudden? Why do you think it's higher now than it was at that point of white hot rage?
Yeah, it's sustained, and this is different. I mean, we see that after an election because there's a partisan element or a philosophical element. When the Liberals get in, we get crabby, and we start looking at those options. But usually after a couple of months, a few months, it'll sort of fade down. In this case, it's growing. But I think it's a sense of futility because nothing is changing. We're not seeing any better treatment from Ottawa. We are all feeling beaten down. We're feeling hurt. We feel there's industries that could help us get out of this horrific hole we're digging over the pandemic, but we've got a central government that is working its darndest to shut in our prime industries. So that's making people think we've got nothing to lose. We really don't. And, when we look at these numbers right now, the other differential was when you look at the whole West versus Alberta, because that changes a lot of the questions. I mean, the favorite people say, well, you'd be landlocked. I say, yeah, it would be like Switzerland with oil. But, beyond that, if it's all four provinces, then you've got a more diverse economic base. You do have coastline access. There's a lot of questions get answered that way. So it holds more appeal for people. But with a looming potential federal election coming, when we're going into it with this much discontent, if we see the Liberals get back in, I expect we're going to see these numbers grow a heck of a lot more again.
I think another reason driving these is the movement's never been broadly organized to sustain support for independence between elections. When Chrétien was reelected in 2001, there was an uptick, and then it quickly went away, and it completely disappeared essentially when Stephen Harper came to power. It's been ticking along for some time, and it really upticked when Trudeau was reelected in October 2019. It did go up after he got elected in 2015, but it went away. There was no sustainable, organized independence movement or party with any kind of mainstream recognition at all. That seems to be a bit different now, and so that's what's driving support after the kind of these flashpoint catalysts that get people engaged. And maybe that's what my guess is. That's probably one thing that's helping to drive it, and perhaps the so far impotence of these fair deal panels that they've. That was supposed to be to make us all feel good without going all the way. Nothing's really come of those.
Nothing.
At all so far. I expect a few things will eventually come to happen, but still nothing so far. Keto, again, we always like to dive beneath the headline numbers here. 25% for Alberta independence, 36% for Western independence within Alberta. In addition to what's, we've kind of talked about maybe what's driving this, but maybe talk about, again, how this is cutting across party lines provincially, how people intend to vote, how it's maybe changing how people intend to vote, and how it breaks down regionally. But maybe you can also talk about, what are the potential opportunities or threats for the UCP in these numbers?
Yeah, again, it's one of those things where, I worked in politics for a long time before I was a pollster, and if I was I've been an advisor to many people over the years, and if I was asked to give Jason Kenney advice on how to handle, all of this, I'd have to shrug my shoulders. It's going to be very difficult to navigate if these numbers stay where they are. In addition to the issue of the scandal that's very partisan divide, in addition to the lockdowns and the rest of the pandemic, even when you get beyond that, these numbers point to, again, that partisan divide among, it's a a huge majority that don't support independence for Alberta among all votes. It's a virtually universal in say Edmonton. It's almost 3/4 majority in Calgary. I forget. I don't have the table sitting in front of me, Derek. If you have it there, in the rest of Alberta, I believe it's just over 50. Is it? Does it touch 50%?
Western independence itself, I think, was 48 or 49. It was within the margin of error for a statistical tie. So outside of the two big cities, so rural, including the smaller cities, Red Deer, Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, Grand Prairie, Fort Mac, all of those combined, it was a statistical dead heat. As you said, Edmonton, it was low double digits. It was in the teens, lower teens. And then, as usual, Calgary is always kind of in the middle. A significant majority against it, but a not insignificant minority in favor of it. But we sliced and diced how this went by party affiliation. It was, NDP supporters were almost unanimously against Alberta independence and close to unanimously against broader Western independence. Unsurprisingly, Wild Rose Independence Party voters were overwhelmingly in favor, although not as close to unanimous as I would have thought. Maybe we'll get your thoughts on that. Why? Like 20%, I think, of Wild Rose Independence Party voters don't support independence, which is in the name of that party. Be interested in your thoughts on that. But among UCP supporters, if I remember correctly, it was almost 50-50 support and opposition for independence for Alberta. But when you make it Western independence, which seems to have a broader appeal, it was something like 60-something% of UCP voters. I forget if it's past or current intended, but something around 60-something% of UCP voters backed Western independence. Love your thoughts, Kito.
Yeah, so when you look at those breakouts and you kind of, you ask yourself the same question about, how does Jason Kenney and the UCP handle this moving forward? Assuming these numbers sort of stay relatively the same or grow, and it's hard to believe they would come down at least until the pandemic is over and people are vaccinated and life can return to normal, and maybe then the economy starts doing better. With these numbers, that's the challenge is, again, a majority want to stay, a very significant majority want Alberta to continue being part of Canada, and yet your own political base. So how do you stick handle that? That's near no win, as near no win as as some of the lockdown measures numbers indicate. So I guess I have to give credit to Jason Kenney on the fact that if it wasn't for him, I would almost bet that this number, that he wouldn't be able to hold on to that UCP base if it wasn't for Jason Kenney. I know I've seen some comments on social media saying, oh, well, then you have to get rid of Kenney and bring in a new leader. I think that would be disastrous for the United Conservative Party. I don't think another leader could hold that coalition. I think it would instantly crumble. Again, no judgment on that. If you want it to crumble, maybe that's a good thing for you. But I think, just to point out the fact that given these numbers and where other numbers are, that Jason, it's to his credit of the strength of his leadership that he's even able to hold that number as far down as they are today in the polls. Got to give him credit for that.
So I'm going to ask both Corey and Kito the same question here about. We're going to kind of preempt our next poll coming out. It's actually not going to come for a few days, but we've been releasing a poll a day ever since Friday afternoon or Friday evening. We've got another poll coming out with federal vote intentions. It's essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, Kito, but it's essentially what we've seen for quite a while. Conservatives in a commanding lead, but maybe soft a little bit, but not that soft. Liberals in a distant second, followed by the NDP. Nothing that crazy. But it's the first time I've seen any polling done with the Maverick Party put into the mix. Remember, they were the Wexit Party. They're kind of like the federal Bloc Québécois of the right, of the West. No pun intended. That's kind of how they build themselves. They're kind of like the Western Bloc, but they renamed themselves Maverick. They were polling at 3%. So in a statistical tie with the Green Party. If you're not beating the Green Party in Alberta, it's going to be a tough way up. They were at 3%, but Wild Rose was at 9%. But Alberta Independence is at 25, and Western Independence is at 36. So, Keto, you've talked about, the job that Kenny has done in keeping most people who support independence aren't actually currently voting for independence parties. A lot of them have left, but a majority of people who would vote for independence are still not voting for parties that support independence. You've talked about that. Maybe talk about the other side about why, and I guess they're different. Maybe you have to break them down federally and provincially because their support levels are quite different. But why is it that if 36% of Albertans support independence, broadly speaking, Western, why do only 9% back the Wild Rose provincially and only 3% support the Maverick federally? I'll put it first, maybe to Corey, and then we'll put it to Keto.
Well, sure. I mean, part of it, to be blunt, your average person on the ground hasn't heard of the Maverick Party. They came out. Jay Hill is a competent guy and experienced, but it hasn't been rumbling across the prairies. We haven't seen a lot of ground organization or press covering it, so they don't realize it's there as an option. They're really in their infant stage as far as a party goes at this point. But I mean, if his polling is indicating anything, there is a large area of voters they can target as a federal entity if they can position themselves that way. But they've obviously just got a long battle to go before they get there.
Back to you, Keto. Why is it that if you've got 25% for Alberta and 36% for the West in terms of independent support, why is Wild Rose and provincially only at 9 and Maverick federally only at 3?
Yeah, I guess my taking my pollster hat off and putting my political guy hat on. I would say easy answer: Jason Kenney. Jason Kenney's the reason. He's been around in politics for a long time, very well known political brand. He's been essentially campaigning for 5 years, close to 5 years, in between seeking the leadership of the PC Party, then the United Conservative Party, then running in the last election. Certainly well known by now. And again, it comes down to leadership. And remember, that all the other parties have, except with the exception of the NDP, all the other parties have interim leaders currently. No one's really, we're in the middle of a pandemic. There's no platform out there for anyone else to really say or do anything. It's very, very difficult to get any kind of oxygen at this point. And the last thing I would say is, remember, people aren't really that simple. Not everybody votes on just one issue. Very few people, in fact, vote on just one issue. There's 27 other things that you consider before you vote. So I guess it's more a matter of, as this issue grows with importance, does it become one of those single issue vote intent? The ballot question is Western independence or Alberta independence. If that's the case, then yeah, that's your ceiling, somewhere between 25 and 36. But it's very rarely ever that simple. People's voting decisions. It's much more complex. So that that's the full explanation there as to why. But it's an interesting question to understand why independence parties wouldn't be doing better with these numbers.
Yeah. Well, actually, and I should point out again, even among Wild Rose Independence Party supporters, it's there's 20-odd% who still wouldn't vote for it. My guess is those are people who probably voted for the original Wild Rose Party. They kind of like the populism and the anti-establishment feel of it, but they're not they're not sovereigntists.
Well,
So.
there's disenchanted UCP supporters who still want a conservative refuge, and
Yeah.
and that's where they're landing right now.
Or, like in Quebec, the Parti Québécois, until recent history, always pulled higher than support for independence. Independence normally, it maxed out at 49.9%. It did get pretty high at one point. But generally, the Parti Québécois could form governments, but they couldn't win the independence referendums. But that's in a province where the politics were not as much along a left-right spectrum, but on a federalist, sovereigntist spectrum. And I think there's signs of that developing in Alberta, but it's not anywhere near what it was until recent history in Quebec. Before we wrap up, I'll just put it out to any of our guests on the show, Keto, Dave, and Corey. Final thoughts on what we're seeing in these polls and what it means. What do you think the trends are going forward?
I think it's going to be an interesting time to be a political watcher in Alberta, gentlemen. It's we've discussed how Kenny's a bit in between a rock and a hard place with the decisions that he's going to have to be making. How does he turn it around from the snowbird scandal? He's got a lot on his plate. So fun days ahead, that's for sure.
I do like this comment here. They call it the firewall protocol. There was a firewall letter written with some ideas, but the firewall protocol sounds like there's a glass case somewhere in the premier's office. You can break it and hit a button, and walls pop up, and everyone from Ottawa is gone, and the money stays. It's a button I'd love to press, but I'm not sure there is a firewall protocol. But I like the term. What? That sounds like a good Jack Bauer movie. The firewall protocol. Or no, it's more of a, what was his name? The big guy who couldn't talk. Martial arts, 90s. It's missing me. Steven Seagal. Sounds like a Steven Seagal movie. Yeah. Keto, let's go to you for your final thoughts, kind of overall impressions on where we are from this poll. And what do you think is going to happen going forward?
Yeah, I just have to echo Dave's thoughts there in that, to me, this is just, if you're a political observer like myself or a pollster or any kind of, it's really interesting times. I think Jason Kenney has basically three challenges between now and the next election, or at least, I guess, going into 2022. First he's got to overcome the instant and ongoing and prolonged anger at the current scandal. That will dissipate. That's just, obviously this poll points to, some further actions he could take that maybe would make people happy. I think time does that on its own. But then he's got the second challenge, which is how to handle restrictions and lockdowns for the remainder of this pandemic. I think that's going to last a lot longer, probably, at least until the fall, maybe to the end of the year. And then going into 2022, if all these things keep doing the same damage and these poll numbers stay the same around independence, Western independence, Western alienation in general being at an all-time high, that will mean that even getting into 2022, it's not like he's going to be skating free. He's still got to stick handle the independence question. And by that time, all the other parties likely are going to have permanent leaders. And maybe that becomes, maybe that gives them a boost as well. So interesting times, looking forward to continuing to measure this as it goes along. And just happy to be back on TV in Calgary, where I know I'm so popular. Thanks for having me.
Well, we normally have about 100 people watching at any time. We're building our audience slowly but surely. It's not that big, but I'm pretty sure it's more than watch CBC Calgary at any time. So welcome to the second biggest show. Corey, I'd like your thoughts as we wrap up.
Just much similar. We're seeing a very volatile electorate, very volatile times. It's just going to be some interesting watching and maneuvering. So from a political watcher, it's gold. From people having to live through it, it's misery. Time will tell.
Yeah, I think it was, I don't remember the exact quote, but Ralph Klein said, look, sometimes the media have an ideological agenda, but more than anything else, they're just fight promoters. We like fights. We like controversy. We want something to happen. I can tell you, Dave and I were dreading the time in the news cycle between Christmas and about a week or two after New Year's because nothing happens. The media are always praying for an earthquake or war or something, so they have something to talk about. That was not the case. We had record readership. We actually had 1.3 million readers in December. We have, I think in the next day or two, we'll probably hit 1 million readers already in January before we even finish the month. We're currently on track for another record month here. It has not been slow. But before we go, I want to thank you all our viewers for their time. I want to thank our members for their support. We greatly appreciate it. We cannot do the Western Standard without you because we do not accept government media bailouts. We're not funded by the unions or special interest groups. So if you enjoy what you're seeing today and you appreciate the work that we're doing, please go to westernstandardonline.com and become a member for a few bucks a month. You can support real independent Western journalism owned and operated here from the West and bailout free. But gentlemen, Keto, Dave, Corey, thank you all very much for your time. I've greatly appreciated it. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.